Hi again, this is Wolf from Wolf-Tek. As part of the release of the Terraballs terraforming kit, I want to show how to use the existing terraforming tools in InWorldz, some cautions about their use and restrictions, but also some tips on how to use them more effectively. Because I know there's a great deal of nervousness and frustration with using those tools, but you might find it easier to use a combination of those tools with the Terraballs than just using the Terraballs on their own. So certainly a familiarity and an awareness of what those tools can do has to be a good thing. So I'm going to do a quick overview of them in this video, and then I'm going to do two more afterwards, one on each of the smoothing and flatten tools. So I have here a fairly dull chunk of rock, kind of a beginnings of a mountain that I was playing with earlier, and what I'm going to do is open up the terraforming tools, so right click and edit terrain. I don't know how clearly these options will show on the video once it goes up to YouTube, so I'll go through each one in turn as they are in the order in the editor. We have select land at the top, which allows you to click and drag and select a rectangular section of land. This is brilliant for when you want to split up a separate parcel of land to have either different music or different permissions or something like that, and that's pretty much all I use it for. You can raise or lower, you can apply any of the tools to that section, but it's very rare that actually a rectangular piece of land is what you want to be working on. It's great if you want to sink a house into the ground that you can just draw a rectangle around, but the rest of the time you're going to be using the freehand tools. It would be lovely if that frame would restrict the effect of those freehand tools, and the way that a graphics editor, for example, you can select an area and any tools that you apply will only be applied in that area. Sadly, that's not how it works with the terraforming. So there's a limited amount of use for this frame. So I'm going to clear that, close that to clear it, and edit terrain again, and go down to the next tool. And this is the flatten tool. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this tool, and I'll be covering its amazing power actually in a subsequent tutorial, but generally I'll just click on it and move the selector. Generally go for a low strength and sort of about a quarter size, something like that, when you first start out, until you know that you're achieving the effect you want to achieve. Then you can speed it up a bit if you wish to, but I'm just going to use that sort of smallish brush and click and hold it in a place and move it around a little bit, and sure enough, if I move my camera down, that area there has now been flattened. It's like pressing it with an iron, but it's a much more powerful tool than that, but too much to cover in this brief overview. We'll do that in the next video. Underneath that we have raise and lower. Now these are frustrating tools to use because no matter how big you make the brush size, they always raise and lower things in a spike from the center of the area. Okay, now making the brush bigger will have a wider effect around it, it'll pull more land up with it, but it still creates a spike. So if I go into raise, for example, make sure your settings are really low here, the strength particularly. You put the strength right up, you'll be creating massive spikes in a second after you click the button. So keep those low, and then you can see if I use the raise tool here, I'm gradually raising this, and if I move it around I can raise different spikes, but it's always only pulling at the center of that area and trying to raise a spike with it. And move it around slowly, you can gradually bring things up. If you increase the strength, which is the temptation because it's very slow, all of a sudden it's getting a little bit quicker. Moving it around and keeping it even is very difficult. And if you put it up, if you're trying to make a mountain, you don't want to be there all day, you put the strength up a bit more. Let's zoom out and think, okay, I want to increase the size, because what I'm trying to do is pull up a nice big mountain. All of a sudden you're panicking, you've got spikes everywhere. It's a very frustrating tool to use. It's also one of the more dangerous ones because you're trying to see how high it is, so you quite often change the angle, and then all it takes is a slip of the mouse and you've wrecked some other part of your area because your mouse has just slipped off the edge of the terrain. The terrain's moving because you're trying to raise it, but in the process you slip and you've wrecked maybe where your house was. Okay? Always use the terraforming tools, raise and lower, particularly from above. I know that's frustrating because you can't see how high it is, and you have to go and have a look down again and to work out whether that's the height you want it at, but it's way safer to do that. You can't accidentally click on another piece of land if you do that. Okay, so we have, instead of having a nice gentle mountain, we have a series of spikes. This is the point where a lot of people give up, especially when you're looking at lowering land rather than trying to create a mountain. Because if you're trying to create a lake, for example, and you're using the lowering tool, I fixed this for somebody just the other day who was frustrated with exactly this and had given up. If I'm trying to create a lake like this one over here, moving it round, you just end up with this really bumpy kind of, it looks okay from the top, but underneath you've got bumps and ridges and stuff. We've got a sim surround on this, which is what that other dark green patch is, but you can see it's not very even. I haven't created the effect I want at all. Well, my advice is don't panic, don't worry about it. The raise and lower tools are only one half of terraforming. What you're going to do is use the smooth afterwards, or even the flatten. So if I use smooth on my mountain now, I'll talk in more detail about the smooth tool in one of the subsequent videos, because there are techniques to note with it, but just for now, okay, I want to smooth my mountain down, and instead of a series of huge spikes, I've got a much more natural looking rounded mountain. You might want some spikes on it. We'll talk more about the smoothing tool later on, but I'm just going to very quickly show you that with our pond, if we use the leveling tool, the flatten, use a nice small brush size and pick somewhere that we actually want that the level is about right. So let's say on this little ridge here, click on there, hold it and move it around, and it levels all the bottom of the pond to the same height as where I started. Okay, so raise and lower, don't panic. They make spikes, but it's only one half of the equation. Okay, you then go on and use either smooth or flatten to get the effect that you want. Okay, back to here, we have smooth, which we've talked about and we'll cover in more detail, and we have roughen and revert. So a quick talk about those. Roughen will do the opposite of smoothing. You move it around, it creates almost random kind of bumps around the terrain. That's actually useful if you just got a flat area that you don't want to be flat. If it looks too artificial because it's flat, then raising it a little bit with that, with a very low strength, is quite a nice way to make something look more natural for somebody at ground level. That's quite bumpy. I had the brush strength a long way up. But that's what the roughen is for. It's just to get rid of that artificial flatness on things. It's brilliant when you first get a sim, just to create a very slight bumpy effect, and quite often that can inspire you in directions of what to actually do with the terrain. So rather than having an entirely flat sim that you start with, roughen it up a little bit and see how it inspires you. Some of those you will turn into hills, maybe you'll put a lake. You just sort of get some kind of random sort of interference on that land to start with and see where it takes you. Revert, and what the revert does is it takes the land back to the last sort of saved setting that it had, which is either how it was supplied to you or how the last raw file, RAW raw file that was loaded up for it, because that's a way that you can buy sort of pre kind of manufactured terrains. If I run it on here, it will take it right the way back to where the land started when I got it, which it is not really what I want. It's not taking it all the way back down to the sort of lower water level, but I don't really want to go and lose all my mountains by doing that. But you can play around with it, and it's a good way. It's sort of an undo effect. So that's a brief overview of the tools. I want to keep these videos reasonably short, and I'll now go on in two separate ones to talk about the flatten tool and the smooth tool. Thanks a lot for listening.